esteemed guests, I'll just ask for you all to take your seats so that we can start our keynote address, our first keynote address for this symposium. So we're just going to wait a couple of minutes for people to take their seats. So just a little bit of explanation. We're going to have our first keynote address now, and it's going to be delivered by Dr. Sebastian Brock. After that, we're going to have two parallel panels. The first panel is going to be about early Syriac literature, and that's going to be here, and the speakers are already sitting on the panel. Then after at the same time as that panel, after Dr. Brock, there will be another panel about medieval Syriac literature in the next hall across the lobby. Okay? After that, we're going to have a coffee break. Then after the coffee break, we're going to come for our second keynote address by Professor Alda Benjamin. Okay? So, first, I'd like to basically make a brief introduction for somebody that really doesn't need an introduction. He doesn't like to be called professor. He prefers to be called doctor. But we know him as Rabot Malfone, Rabbat Malpane, Dr. Sebastian Brock. And just a little bit about his life. He's known as the father of Syriac literature in this era. He is a British scholar specializing in academic studies of classical Syriac language and literature. His research also encompasses various aspects of Syriac Christianity's cultural history. He is generally acknowledged as one of the foremost academics in the field of Syriac studies and one of the most prominent scholars in the wider field of Aramaic studies. And today, he will be speaking with us about Reflections on Entering the Third Millennium of Syriac. Dr. Brock, I would like to ask you to take the podium. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Nicholas. I'd like to dedicate my small talk to the memory of two great scholars. The memory of two great scholars of Syriac culture in this country, namely Father Yusuf Habbi and the late Father Jean-Maurice Fillet, whose wonderful books, Assyrie Chrétienne, are the Bible on topography of the Syriac communities. At the outset, I should say something about the nature of my title. Since I specialized in classical Syriac language and literature all my life, my focus will just be on classical Syriac due to my own limitations. But I hope that much of what I say will be of relevance for those who work on modern Syriac and Neo-Aramaic dialects and their literatures, and also on Syriac culture in general. My paper will be in two parts, each with a different perspective. The first part will be an approach to the subject on a macro level, providing a very broad perspective, while the second part will be on a micro level, and it'll be providing, based largely on my own experience as a student of Syriac tradition over what is now nearly 60 years. And in both approaches, I'll be looking both backwards and forwards in time. So, a sort of bird's eye view. Arameans first appear on the scene in written sources in the 12th century BC, and the earliest witness to Aramaic in a written form dates from the 10th century BC. Aramaic, from which Syriac, of course, constitutes by far the largest literary dialect, has been around in a written form for the last 3,000 years, 2,000 of which also apply to Syriac, which started off as the local Aramaic dialect of Edessa, Urfa. It will be helpful to take a look at the evidence for Aramaic in the 1,000 years before the emergence of Syriac, that is, during the first millennium BC. The earliest Aramaic inscriptions are associated with the various Aramaic city-states that sprung up in the early centuries of the first millennium BC. And in several cases, it is the language of interstate treaties, as witnessed by the bilingual Aramaic Akkadian inscription from Tel Fecheriya in the 9th century BC, or the set of inscriptions from Safiri of the 8th century. Hints that Aramaic was also used for literary purposes are also to be found in the Deir Allah inscription of about 700 BC. But the first definite evidence comes from the 6th century. In any case, it's clear that by the time of the Neo-Assyrian Empire, Aramaic was quite widespread in its use, and indeed to such an extent that it was taken over by the Achaemenid Empire as its chancery language, as its official language, as can be seen from official state correspondences that have been excavated from as far apart as Egypt and Afghanistan. Also from Egypt in the first century, is the first evidence for literary use of Aramaic. And this is in the form of a papyrus from the Jewish colony, or Judean colony, in Elephantine in southern Egypt, where we have fragments of the famous story of Achika. During the late Achaemenid Empire and the Hellenistic period, the literary use of Aramaic is to be found in the, for example, in the Aramaic sections of the biblical books of Daniel and Ezra, in the various fragmentary texts from Qumran, such as the prayer of Nabonidus and the story of Tobit. But from further afield, there are the inscriptions of King Ashoka in Afghanistan, this is 3rd century BC, in which the king Ashoka proclaims the Buddhist moral teaching. While from Egypt, there is an extraordinary papyrus of the 2nd century BC, written in Aramaic, but using the Egyptian Demotic script. Extraordinarily difficult to interpret what the Aramaic is actually saying, but there have been a number of scholars who have done this. And among the Aramaic literary texts that this papyrus contains is a pagan counterpart to the biblical Psalm number 20, and a verse narrative concerning a revolt against Ashurnazirpal. So quite a remarkable set of pieces. The 1st century BC witnessed the emergence of local Aramaic dialects with their own distinctive scripts, known primarily from inscriptions, though sometimes also from legal documents. Thus we have Nabatean Aramaic, for which some 4,000 inscriptions survive, and this is first attested in the early 1st century BC, and it continued in use well beyond the Roman suppression of the kingdom in 106 AD. And then there's Palmyrene, for which we got some 2,000 inscriptions, and this was first attested in the mid-1st century BC and lasted until shortly after the Roman capture of Zenobia in AD 272. And Hatron Aramaic, much the most recent to be discovered, known from some 400 inscriptions, and this is attested from the 1st to 3rd centuries AD. For these three dialects, along with some less well attested other Aramaic dialects, there's no specific evidence that they were once also employed for literary purposes, though one should not rule out the possibility that there had once existed such a literature. but we simply don't know. By contrast, for the three other local Aramaic dialects of that period, their inscriptions from this period are accompanied by a literary use of the dialect in a later form as well. Namely, these are Jewish Aramaic, Syriac, and Mandaic. Jewish Aramaic is especially well represented by inscriptions and papyri, and one of which actually contains a literary poem which is known in its full form from a much later manuscript. Inscriptions in an early form of Syriac are much more sparsely attested, but the situation is improved by the survival of three very important legal documents on skin from the 240s. While Mandaic is represented at this period by a number of incantation texts on lead, many of which haven't yet been read. They're sitting in the British Museum. Coming to the first millennium AD, the early centuries of this first millennium saw the emergence of three late Aramaic dialects which produced a literature which continues in an active and form right up to the present day. That's to say, Jewish Aramaic, both Palestinian and Babylonian, and this is most familiar from the language of the Targumim and from the Talmud, but there's also a lot more Aramaic literature. And it's also noteworthy for some very early and beautiful liturgical poetry. And then, secondly, there's Syriac, and the earliest evidence for literary use of Syriac is in the writings of Bardaisan of Edessa, which of course don't survive, but we do know that he wrote Madroshe, and his pupil, Philip, wrote the Book of the Laws of the Countries, so very close in time to him. And another early witness is the account of the flood in Edessa in 201, preserved in the 6th century Chronicle of Edessa. And then thirdly, we have Mandaic. The two most important books are the Ginza or Siddur Rabbah and the Book of John. But the early date of some of the poetry in the Mandaic canonical prayer book is actually demonstrated by the use of these poems in the Coptic Manichaean psalm book. Quite remarkable case. Now, these three Aramaic literatures can be said to be still very much alive, being actively employed, studied, or used liturgically. And it's important also to remember that there were not only Aramaic dialects to produce literary texts, but there are also three notable cases where an Aramaic literature of the first millennium has not survived. The first of these is Christian Palestinian Aramaic, sometimes known as Palestinian Syriac, and this is attested both from inscriptions from the early 5th century and from literary texts which have survived in manuscripts up to the 14th century. And virtually all the surviving texts happen to be translations from Greek, but there was once quite a considerable literature in Christian Palestinian Aramaic, but it survives only fragmentary and not easily attained because they're palimpsests in many cases. And then another literature that hasn't survived is Manichaean literature. We know that Mani, the founder of the religion, wrote in Aramaic, or some Aramaic dialect, which was close to Syriac. And according to Ephraim, he also wrote Madroshe. Manichaean writings in Syriac have almost completely lost. We've got a few fragments, but translations or adaptations into other languages, such as Coptic or Parthian and other Iranian languages, have been recovered. So we know something of the contents of that literature. And then thirdly, there's pagan literature, which was associated especially in antiquity with the town of Haran. We actually have two relics of this in Syriac literature, which has preserved them. One is a so-called prophecy of their prophet Baba, who probably lived in the 2nd century or 3rd century, and this is preserved in a 7th century collection of prophecies. And then there's an excerpt from a work by Abul Hassan Thabit, which is quoted by Ebroyo, who informs us that this writer from Haran also wrote 16 books in Syriac, as well as others in Arabic. But there's another, probably quite extensive Aramaic literature, of which we know only these 2 details. Well, this situation raises the question, how is it that 3 late Aramaic literatures survive, having been transmitted up to the present day, while 3 other late Aramaic literatures have disappeared, only to be excavated, as it were, by modern scholars? Well, it doesn't take long to provide the answer, if you think about it. The 3 late Aramaic literatures that do survive up to the present day all do so thanks to having been transmitted in the context of a religion that had a continuing interest in preserving them. Although in the case of the Christian Palestinian Aramaic literature, there was a close association with the Chalcedonian Orthodox Church in Palestine, but when the patriarchates of Antioch and Jerusalem went over to the sole use of Arabic, there was no longer any motivation to preserve or transmit this literature in the Christian community. So you can see how a literature can disappear even if it's in the right sort of a religious community. What is important to observe is that in the case of all 3 surviving late Aramaic literatures, it was never a question of state backing. In the entire history of Aramaic, it was only under the Achaemenids that the language had a state backing. And here I'd like to quote the words of a great Arabist scholar, Franz Rosenthal, who was a scholar who also had an interest in Aramaic. And he wrote, "In my view, the history of Aramaic represents the purest triumph of the human spirit as embodied in language, triumph over the crude display of material power. Great empires were conquered by the Aramaic language, and when they disappeared or were submerged in the flow of history, that language persisted and continued to live a life of its own." And then he goes on a little later, it says, "The total sweep of Aramaic history thus presents a marvelous and unique picture. It teaches us that the underdog may in fact have the opportunity to play a decisive role, that it is possible for the word, pure and simple, to dominate empires and to survive their dissolution, and that it is possible for the true achievements of the human spirit to live on, and even after those who attained it are no longer themselves masters of material fortunes of themselves and those around them. It still lives on. In this there seems to be a comforting lesson for our own time. It's a lesson which is plain and inescapable for everyone who has had the good fortune to become acquainted with any segment of the history of Aramaic." End of quotation. The fact that a religion has been the backbone of continuity in each case, that has ensured the survival of each of the 3 late Aramaic dialects, does not necessarily also mean that the surviving literature will be religious in character. In the case of Syriac literature, this is definitely not so, or there's a predominance of religious literature, but there's plenty of secular texts as well. And it's just to give you one example, 2 of the most important surviving medical manuscripts in Syriac are preserved in the library of the Syrian Orthodox Patriarchate, while much of the philosophical literature from late antiquity, which is written in Syriac, has also been preserved over the centuries in the library of a Syrian Orthodox monastery, Deir Surian, in Egypt. Well, what can this tell us about the prospects for Syriac as it enters the third millennium of its history? Past experience would suggest that active state support, often thought as being absolutely of central importance, is not in fact of primary significance in the long term, although it's very useful in a short term. And in any case, the long term, it will inevitably only be, state support will only be temporary in the long term. What, however, would seem to be essential is this link with a religious tradition, or tradition of a religion, which has what one might call a vested interest in the language in question. And so for any long-term outlook for Syriac, it would seem essential to maintain and foster the existing links with the different churches of Syriac tradition and encourage them in the study of Syriac as well, working alongside them and in tandem with them, since in the long term it is they who will be most likely to have an interest in transmitting the language and literature and culture over the centuries. And this seems to me probably just as applicable today, even though the vehicle for transmitting literatures will no longer be material manuscripts or even printed books, but primarily in digital form. So I now turn to a shorter section on a micro-level approach, reflecting the changes that I've experienced over the 60-odd years of my academic lifetime. And it will be helpful if I provide a few autobiographical details first, before looking towards the future. My doctoral dissertation was actually on the Septuagint, on the textual history of the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. At that time, I only had a marginal interest in Syriac, which I'd studied alongside Hebrew and Aramaic as an undergraduate. In 1964, I was fortunate in getting a post teaching biblical history in the theology faculty in the University of Birmingham in England. Birmingham happens to be the home of the Mingana collection of Syriac manuscripts, many of which were originally written in this Kurdish region of Iraq. So I feel I'm coming home instead of going to the Mingana library. I spent much enjoyable time browsing amongst these Syriac manuscripts, discovering all sorts of things that caught my imagination. And this was an experience that converted me to Syriac studies. At that time, Syriac was essentially seen as just an appendage to biblical studies and was taught at an undergraduate level at a small number of universities in the United Kingdom. And at that time, there was no mention in the course of teaching of the existence of the contemporary Syriac communities or the Syriac churches. This separation of academia from the living Syriac tradition began to change in the 1970s, gradually accelerating over time. And particularly important in my case, my personal case, was the contact with Syriac scholars from what we call in England the Middle East, who studied in Rome. In particular, Father Jacques Ishaq, who was later a bishop, Father Pierre Youssef, settled in Paris, and especially Father Yusuf Habbi in Iraq. More recently, two particular developments have proved very beneficial for Syriac studies in Europe and Northern America. Through the influential writings and teaching of Peter Brown of Princeton, Peter Brown managed to create virtually a new field of academic study, namely that of late antiquity. And in his teaching, Peter Brown always encouraged his students to look beyond the Greek and Latin sources to those in Armenian, Coptic, and Syriac. And this has meant that university history departments which teach late antiquity, which are a large number in North America, they're likely to take an interest in applicants for posts who have also studied one or more of these languages. So very useful opening for Syriac, budding Syriac scholars to the academic world. The second development took place with the brilliant but highly controversial book by two eminent historians of early Islam, Michael Cook and Patricia Kroner. Patricia was a colleague of mine once. The book was entitled Hagarism, came out in 1977. It offered a hypothetical reconstruction of the origins of Islam using contemporary non-Muslim sources and paying no attention to the much later Islamic sources. Now, the significance of this book lies not in the particular hypothesis it offered, which the authors changed their minds later, but in the questions it raised. And these have proved immensely important for the study of the emergence of Islam, for which, of course, Syriac and Syriac sources and literature are of special significance. There is, of course, a third recent development of a totally different nature, namely the changes and new possibilities brought about for Syriac studies, and indeed for all studies in the humanities and beyond, by the digital revolution. But several people from the Syriac communities quickly saw the potential offered and started to develop all sorts of new tools. And prominent amongst these scholars and developers, Sargon Hassa and Dr. George Kiraz, who are both present here at this conference. George Kiraz is someone to whom Syriac scholarship owes a huge debt, not least for serving Syriac studies so widely with the publications of the Gorgias Press. Particularly important for all research in the area of Syriac language and literature is George Kiraz's Cedro database, together with this wonderful search tool, Simtho. And these two open up completely new vistas for research in both Syriac language and its literature. A second major technological development concerns the manuscripts which preserve the Syriac literary tradition. In the past, scholars, editors of Syriac texts had to travel often long and time-consuming distances to study the manuscripts of the work they happened to be editing. Today, a very large number of manuscripts can be quickly accessed from the internet by a scholar from his or her study at home. This new situation is in no small part due to two wonderful digitization projects. The first is here in Erbil, le Centre numérique des manuscrits orientaux, CNMO, founded in 1990 by Father Najib Mikhail, now Chaldean Bishop of Mosul. And the second is the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, HMML, in the United States, which has developed in recent years under the inspired direction of Father Columbus Stewart, who's often been visiting Iraq. Likewise, a vast amount of information is now readily available from the internet, from sites such as Syriaca.org and many others. For scholarship and research on Syriac and the Syriac tradition, these are revolutionary developments offering huge promise for the future of Syriac as it enters the third millennium. The, to me and no doubt to many others, unexpected advent of the digital revolution suggests that it would be unwise to offer any predictions about the future of Syriac in the widest sense. Instead, I will just point to three specific areas of the Syriac literary tradition where I personally would hope that younger scholars might be tempted to explore. There are many periods of Syriac literature which are still very poorly studied or not studied at all. So these are three areas which in particular come to my own mind. The first is most specialized, and that is the 9th century was a time of great intellectual ferment under the Abbasid caliphs. This ferment ran across all the different religious communities, the Muslim, Jewish, Christian, Zoroastrian. And as far as the Syriac side is concerned, major works of some of the great authors of that period still remain unpublished or published in an inadequate form, let alone studied against their wider intellectual background. So that's one topic where I hope people will pay attention. And then secondly, and this is much more general, an even more neglected area of Syriac literature is the period from the 14th century onwards, despite the existence during this long period up to the present day of a number of major authors, and probably many more major authors will one day be discovered. So that's the second of my wish lists. Third of my wish lists is this. And this applies to an area that I have never covered, and that is modern Syriac and Neo-Aramaic dialects and their literature. And several of these dialects have already developed quite an extensive literature of their own of note. While a great deal of attention has been paid to the modern dialects themselves from the point of view of language and linguistics, not least by my Cambridge colleague Geoffrey Khan and his students. Many of his students are here, I'm glad to say. But despite the concentration or study of the language from linguistic point of view, not so much attention has been paid to the literature, especially to the poetry in these modern dialects, with the notable exception of an Italian scholar, Alessandro Mengozzi, and a few others. There are, of course, numerous other prolific areas or potential areas of study and research, above all those which make use or benefit from the new possibilities provided by the various new digital tools. But not to be forgotten, since I haven't touched on them in this field, but they shouldn't be forgotten as they're very important, are the fields of music, folklore, and popular culture. These all deserve proper study and should be included in any program for the study of Syriac tradition. So in brief, there's no lack of exciting new areas of research and exploration which are offering themselves to coming generations of scholars. Some of these new areas will no doubt emerge in the course of the present conference in the papers. So we look forward to hearing these papers and discovering what we need to look at in the future. So thank you very much.
So now we are going to have two parallel panels. Early Syriac literature will be in this room, and medieval Syriac literature will be in the next hall. So I'll just give you a couple of minutes if you want to move around. If some people want to go to the next hall. And then I will leave you all in the capable hands of Dr. Brock.
Thank you. Ah, good. Yes. Sorry, you have to stick your mouth a little bit closer to the mouthpiece. Very good. I shall try. Translator cannot hear me. I sent my text. He does not have my text then. All right. All right. I would like to begin by considering my topic from a broader perspective before honing in on a few case studies. As we all know, there are ethno-religious linguistic groups today which claim Chaldean or Assyrian identity, which can imply an unbroken tradition with the distant past. This has provoked an ongoing scholarly debate which has spilled over into my own subject of Assyriology. While some of my colleagues, such as Eckhard Fram, have been careful to distinguish ancient and modern Assyrians from each other, some others, such as Simo Parpola, have sought rather to trace modern Assyrian cultural heritage back to the Neo-Assyrian period. Indeed, Parpola has even suggested that the Assyrian state religion contained esoteric elements which later informed Eastern Christianity. At least in my mind, this debate centers upon whether or not the Assyrian identity predates the spectacular Mesopotamian archaeological discoveries of the 19th century. Certainly, Sargon Donabed and Shamiram Mako have pointed to a passage of an account by the British traveller Horatio Southcote, published in 1844, which hints at this notion, with Christians being called Asuri by Armenians prior to the decipherment of cuneiform. Moreover, Assyrians are also mentioned as such in the 18th century correspondence of King Heracles II of Georgia, as studied by Constantine Tsereteli, and there are doubtless many other attestations of which I am entirely ignorant. What is important about Southgate's testimony is the emic claim that Aramaic-speaking Christians descended from the biblical Ashur. What might have inspired this? Certainly, toponyms derived from Assyria, the Mat Ashur in Akkadian, survived long after the fall of the empire itself. Most prominent are the Achaemenid province of Athora in modern northern Iraq, the Sasanian... Am I getting a different microphone? Or two microphones? Oh, okay. This is my... Oh, Lord. I have to stay at this distance. Very good. Apologies for the microphone issues. So, most prominent are the Achaemenid province of Athora in modern northern Iraq, the Sasanian province of Asoristan, encompassing modern Mesopotamia, or, of course, classical Syria. We might think of the Hellenic-era satirist Lukianos of Samosata's claim to be an Assyrian. Aramaic was the predominant language in all of these regions, and any or all of these might have fostered demonyms, reminiscent of the biblical Athor, particularly as the Aramaic language was associated with ancient Assyria, as will be seen. Moreover, within Syriac historiography, a tendency to harmonize biblical genealogical and historical geographical information with more contemporary tradition is evident. For example, both St. Ephrem and Michael the Syrian transposed the foundations of the biblical figure Nimrod onto the contemporaneous Upper Mesopotamian landscape, with Edessa notably corresponding to biblical Eresh. As a result, it seems entirely plausible to me that this association between Assyria and the Aramaic Christians developed quite naturally over centuries of Syriac historiography and Aramaic language folk tradition. Perhaps this also rose in contradistinction to the Catholic Church's designation of those Eastern Christians who accepted its authority from the 16th century onwards as Chaldeans. These musings aside, what is undoubtedly crucial is the role that Aramaic has played in the preservation of earlier traditions. Islam brought with it not only a new language, but also a new historical and geographical conception, if not mythology, which supplanted pre-existing tradition. Hence, Aramaic-speaking groups, whether Christian, Jewish, or Mandean, and other minorities such as the Yazidis, have certainly retained much more of Mesopotamia's pre-Islamic culture than mainstream Muslim communities in the region. Nonetheless, for all these cultural linguistic minorities might preserve fossilized traditions from earlier periods, we must also recognize the capacity of all cultures to suddenly invent ostensibly ancient traditions, as famously formulated by Eric Hobsbawm and Terence Ranger. The problem is acutely demonstrated by the possible survival of elements from Akkadian language Gilgamesh literature in the northeastern Neo-Aramaic oral composition Qartine Gabara. This epic was first consigned to writing by William Daniel, inspired by a variety of folk sources, but also considerably reworked in order to create a national poem for modern Assyrians. It is hence difficult to separate genuine folk elements with Gilgamesh-like content from Daniel's own remolding of this oral literature to represent the Gilgamesh story. The only means of teasing out the older tradition is by comparison of its contents with what documentation exists of unrelated oral traditions. Regrettably, these are approaching complete extinction, and urgent documentation efforts are required. All right, with all of this said, I would like now to turn to some potential case studies in transmission which I have collected. Let us begin with the transmission of Akkadian literature into Aramaic, the first necessary step. So, bilingualism among the Assyrian and Babylonian scribal classes was probably quite frequent. Although practically all non-monumental Aramaic texts from this period are lost due to the use of perishable media, I have been able to identify that bilingualism was already present to some degree by the early 9th century at the very latest. This can be deduced from the fact that local Aramaean rulers were sometimes made into Assyrian governors during this period, and their names were translated into Akkadian. The earliest attestation for this practice which I can identify is from the 890s BC. In turn, scribes copying literary texts also possessed this capacity, at least in some cases, as is demonstrated by a mistake found by Andrew George, an exemplar of the standard Babylonian Gilgamesh epic. Here, you can see this at the very bottom of the screen, a scribe confused the sign dumu, read in Akkadian as maru and meaning son, with the sign en, read as belu in Akkadian and meaning lord. As the old Aramaic word for lord is mare, this mistake could only have been made by a native speaker of Aramaic who had accidentally lapsed while copying into his own language while copying down a text from dictation. All right, let's move on. So, I mean, in the end, this relationship actually runs much deeper, and it lasted the entire duration of the period, and we have to also think, for example, that there are actually Akkadian texts which were probably influenced by Aramaic literature. The example I can give here is the Naiad Shuhu epic. However, these are not sort of directly appear within classical literature. However, I would like now to turn on to one little interesting exception, and this is Achika. I would contest that while it is, of course, Achika does appear within the Syriac sources, but there's one very interesting new reading which was made by James D. Moore on the Elephantine papyrus, about which we just heard, which mentions Sinharib ruling in Kalach, i.e. ancient Nimrud. This is very interesting because this Achika tradition is different from that on the rest of the papyrus. While this seems puzzling, it does actually fit the description in the Mar Behnam narrative of Sinharib as the king of Nimrud, and it points to an alternate tradition. Another example I point out here very quickly before we move on to another topic are the Syriac traditions surrounding Sennacherib's murder by his two sons, Adramlech and Sharetzer. As both Amaharak and Nicholas Al-Jalou have noted, the hagiography of Mar Augen records one of these murderers, Sharetzer, running to the environs of Mount Kardu, that's Judi Dar, to a place called Sarguga. So what's interesting about this is that if we actually map this, there's a recent Akkadian text called the Underworld Vision of the Syrian Crown Prince, which puts the other prince further east, where the second arrow is here. This is interesting because when you read the Armenian sources, it says that the two princes escaped after killing Sennacherib, and one settled on the Assyrian border to the west, the first arrow, and the other settled further east. So this would mean that, in fact, the Armenian traditions actually coincide with the historical events, the cuneiform sources, and the Syriac traditions. So this would show that this is actually a completely authentic tradition which has survived. Anyway, with this, let's move on to some sort of more fun, exciting examples from recent history and leave the Assyriology behind. And the first of these is something very strange I found in a travel account. So, we see here in 1832 that an obscure Lithuanian Jew called David de Beth Hillel published an account of his travels through the Middle East. He notes in one passage the ruins of the ancient city of Nineveh, modern Nineveh, by Mosul, and provides a fascinating anecdote which is very pertinent to our study. The date is very important because Claudius James Rich had only visited in 1820, and it wouldn't be until 1840 that excavations began. Hence, what de Beth Hillel tells here must have been a genuine local tradition of the Jews with whom he stayed in Mosul, rather than some sort of later invention. So, the story is allegedly set around 1680 AD in Mosul, and it describes a mysterious flooded pit by the Tigris, by the ruins of Nineveh, into which a pasha would like someone to explore. So a Christian comes forward and he says that he will dive into it. Now, we might imagine that this pit probably emerged from looting. There's actually references to looting of Nineveh already in Herodotus and also in Ctesias, in my opinion. So, we have what's interesting is the Christian leaps into the water, and there he says he could not get to the bottom of it. However, he found a shelf in the wall and found there a small gold writing box. And in this, he finds a diamond engraved with the following words in Chaldean. So this is probably, actually, in my opinion, a reference to genuine Assyrian foundation tablet cases, which is what this golden case must be, and of foundation tablets. You can see two examples here which have been found. They appear in different valuable metals. Hence, we can assume that, in fact, the diamond mentioned here is an exaggeration. No? However, it seems entirely plausible that there was a waterlogged pit in Nineveh, a Christian jumped into it and pulled out this mysterious inscription. However, the most interesting part is what he does. He translates it for the Pasha. So he states that there wasn't a diamond engraved with these words, and he says that it's Sultan Lulu, which means Emperor Sanherib. The Pasha then thanks him. What's very interesting about this story, though, is that it reflects two actual historical figures. One is Badr ad-Din Lulu, who ruled Mosul in the 13th century, and the other is, of course, Sennacherib, we've already heard about. This is interesting because it shows that the oldest Assyriologist we know of in history, the first Assyriologist ever, was in fact an Assyrian. He couldn't actually read the inscription, he lied to the Pasha. However, he was still the first Assyriologist. This is also very important, and it's why I mention it here in my talk, is because it gives us an idea of how much people actually historically knew around roughly, let's say, 1830 or so. No? It demonstrates quite easily that a lot of the historical tradition that we would hope survived may only have survived among priests and similar. But in fact, for the everyday laity, Sennacherib was the same as Sultan Lulu. All right, let's move on quickly to another quick example. And here, this is rather fun. We talk about modern-day folklore. And we see here that there is a description in Wigram and Wigram, which was already noted by Nicholas Al-Jalou some time ago, of a horrible monster known as the Khwarha. And this Huarha travels around at night and carries off children and eats them, I guess, or kills them. And hence children before they are baptized have to be watched for 8 days. What's interesting is they mention, and this story comes from the Tiare, that an onion and a wool comb must be kept in the room to stop the creature from coming in and stealing the baby. The smell is very powerful and it scares the monster away, and the comb catches in her hair, stopping her from getting in. There's also a reference later in the same passage that shows that she could transform into animals. This is very interesting when we look at the Mesopotamian evidence for the Lamashtu, the famous demon you might know from antiquity. I've given a couple of different sort of examples here. We notice that she is described in a furious way. She has an animalistic head with matted hair. She runs in the tracks of animals. So she's also associated with the ibex. You can see different animals. There's a donkey, for example, here in this depiction. And she also tries to sneak into houses. You can see here that I've given you two different incantations here from Mesopotamian sources where protective gods have to guard the door to stop her from going in, exactly as we heard in this story. Now, if we move a little bit closer, the comb is very interesting that catches her hair, because we can see that on a lot of art historical depictions from the Assyrian period, a comb is always placed next to her. In turn, which is rather striking, we see she's given a comb and also a sort of a spindle for weaving when she is sent away in this incantation. But most strikingly is that, in fact, in traditional Yazidi and also Kurdish dek tattoos, one sees the same comb, spindle, and in fact the gazelle, which also appears, as you can see, on one of the depictions here. These are, of course, these dek tattoos are protective for women. And I think this is very interesting because this could be some sort of survival, perhaps inspired by actual discoveries of these amulets. Hard to say. The final point is the onion. This is because onions, of course, smell, which keeps away bad things. However, when we look here, we can see also that part of the incantation, the ritual to remove Lamashtu, involves creating a mixture involving onions and setting a light to it to fumigate away the demon. So this is very striking. I asked myself whether this is actually a genuine survival of a very ancient way of keeping away nasty demons from children. While this is a very long span of time, it is worth saying we can think of European folklore. One sees the same situation in which, in fact, demons and everything bad are the most conservative part of a culture. No? They last an extremely long time. For myself, I'm a German. We still talk about kobolds hiding in the shadows and attacking people. All right, so a final example before we're done on my little journey. And here it is the Hambash. And the question whether this fits to the famous monster Humbaba from Gilgamesh. And I've heard some Assyrians have told me already that they believe that it is Humbaba, but we need to, of course, be objective in how we do this. So a quick summary of this. The Hambash monster is said to reside in mountains and foothills of the Zagros, and sometimes he lives in caves. In some examples, he's described as being like a cyclops, and there's actually one Neo-Aramaic folk account I found in which the story of Odysseus and the cyclops is retold, except it's a little Christian girl fighting the big nasty Hambash. So one possible etymology is from Habash, meaning Ethiopian, and this does fit with a lot of descriptions in antiquity of people on the edge of the world being monstrous. And interestingly as well, in the Syriac version of the Alexander romance, he travels to the edge of the world, to Ethiopia, where he fights a monster. And in the later Iskandername, we actually find this monster being called the Hambash monster, or the Habash monster, sorry. So from all this then, there's a very interesting folk description of this, which was documented by Jared Greenblatt in 2011 on his work on the Jewish dialect, the Jewish Aramaic dialect of Ahmadiyya. And here we see a rather long description. I'm going to focus in on a couple of points that this person raises. The first interesting point is that this folk account describes that there are 3 Hambashaya beneath the city of Ahmadiyya. These are, of course, the 3 Parthian rock reliefs which are right there. This might also explain why the Hambash is sometimes described as a cyclops, because, of course, the sculptures are side-on, so you only see one eye. This is, of course, very interesting, but the much more interesting part, which ties this together with earlier evidence, is that, in fact, Humbaba, as we think of him from Gilgamesh, is not called Humbaba in Aramaic, he's called Hobabish. This is actually a tradition going back probably to Hittite text, where he's called Hupipish. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls, Qumran, we find multiple references to a Galgamesh or Gilgamesh and Hobabish. And what's striking here is in turn that this spelling Hobabish, Hobabas, or similar, is not all that far away from Humbash. And if we read our account again here, then it's noted that God punished the Humbash for not believing in him and turned them to stone because they had no religion. This is not dissimilar from the Qumranic Book of Giants, in which the giants, of which Gilgamesh and Hobabish are two, are ultimately punished by God for not believing. So I ask myself if it's possible that this folk story about the Humbash actually goes back to a memory of this Qumranic Book of Giants, especially as it was quite widespread as a result of Manichaeanism, which, as we've heard, there's not much evidence for. So finally, let's sum up in the last moments. What I'd like to argue, at least I'd like to present as a possibility today, is that there are transmission histories which we can explore. I don't think the historical stuff is all that strong, as my example of the Christian who jumps into the water to read the inscription demonstrates. I think they only knew about a couple of ancient kings, and they would tie everything to them, although, of course, Syriac historiography was much more sophisticated, but on an everyday level, probably not many kings were known. However, I do think that folklore could be an interesting way of investigating some of it further. I've given you two nice examples here, one of the Hawarha and one of the Humbash. And I'm hopeful that with better documentation, we might be able to see whether my ideas work or whether they're complete confabulation. And I think that if we just document things more systematically, then this will be possible. Another thing which particularly interests me are folklore accounts, because and travel accounts, especially from the 19th century and earlier, because this is from a time before the Assyrian people could read cuneiform, and hence what information is kept there is probably much more authentic than what might exist today, as I gave you the example of Katani Gabara, where recent Gilgamesh traditions have been mixed into it. And a final tantalizing point, what would be a first step? For me, it would be the final publication of a very interesting account found in Santa Sabina in Rome, the Compendiosa Relazione Storica dei Viaggi fatti del padre Domenico Lanza. This was a priest of the Dominican order who traveled to Mosul in the 18th century, and he stayed there for 30 years. Now, his account is 600 pages long and has never been published. However, Italian scholars who have looked at it have said that it's full and rich of information. If we can begin collecting and publishing such interesting early accounts, especially from Dominicans and other priests who are in the Middle East, who are often very keen on recording this information, we may be able to create an interesting database of early modern folklore, which then can be compared against Syriac sources to see whether it is valid or not. Anyway, with that, thank you very much for listening to my musings as a non-Syriacist, and I'll say thank you, zor spas, and so on.
Very fascinating. I think instead of having questions now, we'll reserve questions for the end of time, since we're already running late. And so our next paper should be by Dr. Umut Var, but it will be read by Dr. Ramazan Turgut from the Mardin Arto University. But his title is The Last Roman Emperor, Topos in Syriac Apocalyptic Texts, Revisiting Genealogical and Characteristics Issues. So thank you very much, Dr. Ramazan.
Thank you, Malfono Rabo. My name is Ramazan. As Malfono had mentioned it, I am not the owner of this presentation, but I have a funny story for you. When this program would be announced, I had talked with Nicholas to put me in the session of Malfono Rabo, and actually I have bribed him $200 to put me in, but he refused me. And I said, okay, so I will wait for my session. But when people have a plan, God has another plan, so somehow I have been in his session again. I'm happy for that, but I'm sorry for my friend College that he couldn't manage it and lost this opportunity. So I have no presentation slides. I will just read the text for you with my non-British accent, English accent. In Syriac apocalyptic literature, knowing the name of an entity is equivalent to uncovering all its mysteries and furthermore exerting control over it. For example, in the Old Testament, which serves as one of the primary sources for Syriac apocalyptic literature, this onomatological concept is often approached with an ontological framework, and numerous examples can be found. The significance attributed to onomatology is also observed in apocalyptic texts, whereas in the Syriac texts that include the last emperor topos, the character's name is never mentioned. Consequently, the emperor, the pseudo-Methodist apocalyptic text, is recognized by his sacred lineage, just governance, and the supernatural events that occur upon the completion of his mission. Under this heading, this characteristic feature associated with the last emperor topos will be analyzed in detail. The genealogy of the last emperor. The practice of the construction sacred genealogies of emperors was a rhetorical tool frequently employed throughout the Middle Ages, a continuation of ancient practice, emphasizing connections of these emperors with past heroic rulers or Old Testament prophets and reinforcing the belief that honor and nobility were inherited by blood, resonated with both the populace and the aristocracy, strengthening the legitimacy of the emperors. The author of the pseudo-Methodist apocalyptic text similarly employed this rhetorical device, constructing the genealogy of one of the most important figures after Christ. In the narrative, it seems implausible for character tasked with the rescuing Christians from various persecutions before the return of Christ to the uncertain or humble lineage, given the collective ruler consciousness of the time. Subsequent apocalyptic texts often follow the lead of pseudo-Methodists in their presentation of the genealogy with only minor variations. Last emperor is as follows. After Alexander, the first king of the Greeks, died without a wife or child, his generals took control. Alexander's mother, Kushat, returned to her father's house in the kingdom of Kush. King Buz, who built the royal city of Byzantium on the seashore, sent his general Germanicus to the king Phil of the Kushites, establishing a peace agreement with him. Buz wrote to Phil, asking for the hand of his daughter in marriage and to make her queen. Phil, pleased with the gifts sent by Buz, traveled to Byzantium with 30,000 Kushites. Upon arriving near the Sea of Chalcedon, King Buz welcomed him with joy and gave him various royal gifts. Buz then took his daughter, Kushat, as his wife, and they had a daughter, Byzantia, named after the city Buz had built. Romulus, the king of the Romans, took Byzantia as his wife and loved her greatly for her beauty. As a simple man, devoid of any malice or deception, Romulus gave Rome as dowry to Byzantia. This caused great unrest among the Roman nobility. Byzantia bore Romulus 3 sons, Romulus, Urbanus, and Claudius. Romulus ruled Rome after his father, Urbanus ruled Byzantia, and Claudius reigned in Alexandria. Thus, the descendants of the king Phil's daughter, Queen Kushat, came to rule over 3 kingdoms of Macedonians, Romans, and Greeks. The prophecy goes on to state that as foretold, the king who will rescue the faithful from the world's evil will rise from this Cushite lineage. An interpretation proposed by theologian Wood weaves the inclusion of the Cushite kingdom as reflection of Christological debates. The Syriac Orthodox Church, the contrast to the Byzantine Church, adhere to Miaphysite Christology, which holds that Christ has one nature, both divine and human, without confusion. The Byzantines, on the other hand, supported a Diophysite view, which separated Christ's divine and human nature. Following the Council of Chalcedon, which condemned the Miaphysite position, the Syriac Orthodox Church faced persecution and withdrew from Byzantine influence, developing its own ecclesiastical structure. Both Martinez and Shahid and Wood interpretations deserve a degree of skepticism, as the evidence used to support these claims is limited in both quantity and quality. As you can notice, I am trying to summarize the text because we don't have much time, and some of us are still sleeping, so it would be good to have extra time. Despite these debates, it is important to note that genealogy presented in pseudo-Methodist is riddled with anachronism and lack historical accuracy. The author was not concerned with maintaining a precise chronology or historical reality, but instead aimed to inspire Christians with an eschatological narrative. By blending idealist past leaders with allegorical elements, the author constructed a savior figure for the faithful. The sons of Ismail will boast of their victories, eat, drink, and rest. The faithful will have no hope of being delivered from harsh servitude. They will be oppressed, crushed, humiliated, and will suffer hunger and thirst. The sons of Ishmael will dress in bright garments like bridegrooms, and will tell the Christian that no Savior will come for them. Then, suddenly, like a woman in labor, birth pangs will come upon them, and the king of the Greeks will rise against them with great wrath. He will awaken against them like a man who throws his wine. The one whom they thought that will rise from the sea of Cushites against them and bring destruction of Yathrib. The narrative of the policies of the last emperor. The pseudo-Methodist apocalyptic text frames the narratives of the reign of the last emperor around struggles against Muslim Arabs and the pursuit of prosperity in domestic policies. The struggle initiated by the author against the enemy is depicted as follows. The son of the king of the Greeks will side the desert regions. The enemies will follow them in terror from all directions. Their wives and sons, their leaders, and all their cities, all the lands of their father's desert will be handed over to the power of the Greek king. They will be delivered to destruction, captivity, and slaughter under his sword. His oppression will be 100 times stronger than those under their own rule. They will be in the midst of harsh disaster, such as a hunger, thirst, and exhaustions. They will be enslaved. They, their wives and children will serve as slaves to those who once served them, and their slavery will be 100 times more bitter than before. The people will live in great peace. Churches will be renewed, cities will be rebuilt, and priests will be exempted from taxes. Clergy and the rest of the people will escape from suffering and anxiety because this is the peace mentioned in God's gospel. Humanity will not suffer. They will eat and drink and rejoice with happiness in their hearts. Men will take wives and women will be given to men. They will build houses and plant grapes from which they will produce wine. Conclusion. The Syriac pseudo-Methodist apocalyptic text stands as a unique example not only for the body of text written by Eastern Christian, but also for Byzantine, Armenian, Georgian, Coptic, Slavic, and Latin apocalyptic literature in terms of its content, method, and narrative structure. The study has examined one of the most important characters in the text, the last emperor, and the components of his character. In addition to addressing current debates regarding the text and its character, this analysis aimed to present new theses on the topic. This work serves as both warning for Eastern Christians who had experienced significant social administrative changes with the rise of Islam in the 7th century, to rid themselves of the sins that were blamed for the loss of their old order, and a motivational tool developed to signal the approach of the long-awaited victories. The author embeds these objectives within an intense allegory and eschatological narrative. One of the characters that provides intense motivation for Christians within the narrative is the last emperor. By adding elements of theocentric historiography and Old Testament figures to the last emperor topos, the author constructs a narrative filled with allegorical components regarding the emperor's lineage, years of reign, and his ascension to God's paradise. This study has examined the components of the narrative with which the last emperor topos is placed. Finally, the construction of the last emperor's character involves adopting Christ-like features through imitatio Christi. Through the symbolic representation of his ascendant to his Byzantine throne and his execution at Golgotha, the author mirrors Christ's narrative in the life of the last emperor, reinforcing the text's eschatological themes.
Thank you very much. It was most kind of you to read that, Dr. Ramazan. Thank you very much. It's a fascinating story. If anyone hasn't read Pseudo Methodius, I recommend it. It's a good novelistic as well as apocalyptic text. We should move on to our third speaker, Dr. Bert Jacobs from the Catholic University of Leuven in Belgium, reconstructing the lost Syriac theological works, the case of Moshe Bar Kifu, and you'll be speaking in English too. Thank you very much. Over to you.
All right, 1 moment. While the PowerPoint is being set up, I just want to thank the organizers for organizing this historic event. It's really good to be here. It was an ideal opportunity for me to travel to the Athra of Syriac.
Sorry, the screen's not going.
Oh,
Waiting.
maybe, okay, welcome. So after these earlier presentations covering large periods of history, my presentation will be more focused in time and also on one particular author. And I was particularly glad to hear Professor Brock singling out the 9th century as an interesting period for future scholarly studies. So the Moshe Bar Kifu is indeed, I think, one of the most important authors of the Syriac Orthodox Church.
It's plugged in. I don't understand why the screen is not. 1 minute.
1 minute? Okay. Yeah, I think I can start. I'll begin and then we'll see when the PowerPoint appears. One reality that every student of Syriac literature must face is that, as in other fields, countless works have not survived the turmoils of history. Other works have only partially been preserved. In this presentation, I would like to discuss an interesting fragmentary work preserved in the British Library collection, the single manuscript preserving the introduction to the commentary on the Gospels by the prolific Syriac author Moshe Bar Kifo. Born around 833 in the town of Balad, which is modern Eski Mosul, Bar Kifo served as the Syriac Orthodox bishop of Beth Ramman to the north of Takrit until his death in 903. Despite the importance of Bar Kifo in the history of Syriac literature, this particular manuscript has attracted limited scholarly attention. Yes, and we will see the manuscript in 1 second. There we have it.
F5.
Yes.
Sorry, the cable had come out.
Good. And so, yeah, no, not there. So one reason for this limited scholarly interest is presumably the very poor state of the manuscript, which makes it difficult to work with. Yet, as I will argue, precisely because of the prominence of Bar Kifo in Syriac literature, other texts related to it can be of help to reconstruct some of its lost portions. And so by determining these textual relations, new pathways may be opened. First of all, I would like to mention this book by Salam Rassi on the apologetic theology of Abdish of Nisibis. And so, as Salam points out, Abdishu was working in a paradigm of composing summary, comprehensive expositions of the faith, a genre that is often known as a summa theologiae or theologica. And this tradition, reaching back to John of Damascus, became a highly developed genre in Christian Arabic and to a lesser extent in Syriac. And so in his book, Rassi provides a very useful list of 25 relevant summas composed between the 8th and 15th century. And so what he points out is that very little has been known about the development of this genre. And so, but in addition to the works listed by Rassi, there is a noteworthy parallel development of theological systematization in the field of biblical exegesis. Indeed, many Syriac exegetes composed presentations of the faith of their church in the form of commentaries on the scriptures or as, most commonly, introductions to these biblical commentaries. And this includes West Syriac authors such as George of Baaltan, Dionysius Barsalibi, and on the East Syriac side, Theodore Barconi, Ishodat of Merv. And so Moshe Bar Kifo is another prominent author here. He wrote at least 5 theological treatises on the soul, resurrection, angels, divine providence. Almost all of these are unedited. But it seems that the most comprehensive exposition of Christian doctrine he composed in the form of introductions to, respectively, his commentary on the six-day creation in Genesis and his commentary on the Gospels. Luckily, the Bar Kifo's commentary on the Hexameron has been published by Lorenz Schlimme. And so in this edition, we can see that Book 1 is really a very comprehensive exposition of core Christian doctrines, covers the doctrine of God, creation of the world, prophecy, then particularly Moses' prophecy. And so 2 elements I would like to highlight here. So as in these theological summas discussed by Rassi, we see there's certain influence of Islamic theology or kalam in this work. It was Ulbrecht Rudolf who has demonstrated that the structure and the contents of this work has, you can put it next to Muslim theological treatises. Although the exact source is not known, he has shown that the very same topics reappear as in Kalam works of the same period. Another point I want to highlight is that we see also the interrelatedness between the genre of biblical commentary and theological summas. It was Mikhail Tolstoychenko who has shown that several of these chapters were later reused in the Book of Treasures by Jacob Barshako, who was the abbot of the Mormatai monastery. And so apparently the style of Barkifo remained quite attractive to later Syriac Orthodox theologians. Coming to the second introduction in the Gospel commentary. So this work is only preserved in a single manuscript in the British Library, edition 17274. And in addition to the introduction, it also contains some fragments of the commentary on Matthew, Luke, and the Pauline epistles. And some of these are also preserved in other manuscripts. So the first several folios of the introduction are lost, and you see here on the slide, it begins at the end of chapter 17, and then goes on to chapter 18, which discusses the reasons why the Word of God became flesh or incarnate. And I just want to show some other images to get a sense of the state of the manuscript. And so it goes on about baptism, and then there are some shorter chapters on the Eucharist and on the term diatheke and so forth. So you see, it's quite difficult, to edit this. I guess that's the reason why it hasn't been edited. But we can get some knowledge of some of these very fragmentary chapters by considering source-related texts. And I want to demonstrate this by focusing on one particular chapter, which is a chapter responding to the Muslim allegation of scriptural falsification or tahrif. So this is chapter 40. Chapter 40, you see it on the right, the rubric. So this chapter is a defense of the truth of the gospel against the Hanfi, the pagans. So in it, Barkifo develops a quite original apologetic argument, and it's actually based on the Islamic courtroom practice of taking an oath of innocence in case no valid witnesses are presented to support a given allegation. And so before the text breaks down, we can read what's been highlighted in bold. Either you make true witnesses swear that something in it has been changed, or else we will take the oath that nothing in it has been altered. And so one way to get a better sense of the argument and where this is going, we can get from dependent authors. So Dionysius Barsalibi's dependence on Barkifo throughout many of his works is well known. According to the so-called missing link thesis of Verbes and Stimme, Barkifo plays a pivotal role as transmitter of early exegetical traditions to later authors such as Barsalibi, and through him also Gregory Barebaroyo. There is an important nuance by Job Streller. He has shown also that sometimes Barsalibi also accesses these early traditions directly, so it's not always mediated by Barkifo. That's an important point to keep in mind. But nevertheless, studies by Randall Harris, Schlimme, and most recently Saadi, who edited the commentary on Luke, has shown that yes, the influence of Barkifo is really big, and so this raises the expectation that also the introduction, that Barsalibi also relies on Barkifo for the introduction. And it's quite interesting if we compare the surviving fragment that I showed earlier of Barkifo's chapter with the corresponding chapter in Barsalibi's introduction to his gospel commentary, we have a perfect match. And so this allows us to reconstruct Barkifo's original argument, which I find it quite interesting that the argument actually goes on to quote almost literally the hadith, the legal hadith, which is at the basis of the classical law of evidence in Islam. So proof is incumbent on the plaintiff and the oath on the one who denies or the defendant. So and we can still only see the words witnesses and oaths in Barkifo. And so what's interesting here is that we see that in Barkifo, he's a witness to a growing awareness among Christians of Islamic culture and here legal practices. So, but how can we be certain that also the remainder of Barsalibi's chapter, which is fully preserved, is also dependent on Barkifo? And so here it's interesting that we can also approach the issue from the other side. So this was from a later author dependent on him, but we can also go to the other side. And I was able to identify a major source of Barkifo, which is the not so well-known patriarch, West Syriac patriarch, George of Baaltan, died in 790 and lived during this tumultuous period of the transition from the Umayyad to the Abbasid period. And so the source here is his commentary on the Gospel of Luke, which is also entirely unedited. And it's preserved in a quite good manuscript in the Vatican Library, a 2-part manuscript. And before the commentary begins, there's also a very 4-part introduction. And this was also Schlimme who has noted that there are clear parallels in structure between George of Baaltan and Barkifo. And the only main study, the most comprehensive study on this work is by Baumstark in 1902, so that's quite a time ago. And he has also actually noted parallels with Barsalibi. But as far as I have been able to tell, Barsalibi did not knew or used this work directly. So this means that the parallels that we find between Barsalibi and George of Baaltan, we can fairly securely attribute them to Moshe Barkifo. So, and this can give us some sense of the contents of the chapter. And I actually prepared a handout. I can give it to you afterwards if you're interested to see how this works. So in the handout, I highlight, what's here in yellow is the passage we just discussed, which is not in George of Baaltan. So this is, we know that, so this is Barkifo's own contribution. But then it goes on, and the colors indicate the key words, and you see the exact same structure of the chapter that Fortunately, in the copies, the colors are it's black and white. But so you see that basically the argument is he uses the classical rhetorical device to problematize certain statements, to say, okay, who falsified it, what did they falsify, why and when, and the exact same structure and arguments reappear. In Barsalibi, it's a bit more systematized, and my guess is that this is from Barkifo who systematized this, and then Barsalibi is known to have to reduce the material, to abridge the materials. So this goes on. Just the keywords. You can read it for yourself on the handout. In conclusion, Moshe Barkifo and also George of Baaltan serve as windows into the early development of theological systematization in Syriac literature, which is an area that's much understudied, which requires further research. And I also want to say that this is good news for future editors of Barkifo. So even though the manuscript is fragmentary, of course we should edit the fragments. But for passages that are difficult to read or missing, we can see what we have in George Baaltan and in Barsalibi to get a better sense of it, and also to help get some sense of the missing chapters. And another point which I find noteworthy is that this study of this particular chapter also shows that it kind of supports our understanding of Barkifo, that he was, besides a great scholar of the Syriac literature, he was also very much aware of and in dialogue with the Islamic context in which he lived. And so finally, and perhaps most importantly, it is because Syriac has always been a living culture with scholars building on the achievements of earlier generations that reconstructions like this are possible. And so, yeah, may it continue to be a living culture now and tomorrow. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating. I think we've got a few minutes for questions. So, questions to any of the three speakers, except
Not me.
any in absentia. So, questions to two speakers, first and third. Yes, please. Is there a microphone?
Well, that's a quite interesting proposal. I hadn't thought about this, but I guess if you give the text, the other two sources that I gave, you give the text of Barkifo and you highlight what's missing, and then you give the two other texts of George of Belton and Barsalibi, and you say, okay, reconstruct. Well, it might come up with something that gives you some idea, but of course, it's yes, quite probabilistic, and AI may also hallucinate sometimes, but it's an interesting idea. If the technology was available to me, I would like to play around with this. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yes. Thank you.
Please. Yes.
Yes. شوية مع الأسف. Is there somebody who would translate for me, please? Ah, the mysterious microphone. That's where it was. There was a microphone the whole time. None of us knew it.
يسمع؟ بالنسبة للنحوت العمادية اللي طلعتها
أيوة.
قلت عليها أنه لوحوش.
Oh, I need the headphones. I know you were talking about the Jews of Ahmadiyya, the monsters, yes?
ألو ها اسمع. بالنسبة للنحوت اللي ظهرت بالعمادية طلعتها على أساس أنها وحوش.
He's saying
أنت قلت على أساس أنها وحوش. هاي جنود فرسيين مو وحوش يعني أنت كنت تتصور أنها وحوش يعني؟ وبالنسبة للسؤال الثاني
I understand your point.
بالنسبة للحبشي يعني قلت إنه الاستعمال اسم الحبشي على أساس إنه وحش أو شيطان أو فد شيء يعني هيك يعني فعلا أقول للقرن السادس الميلادي ربان برعيته يذكر في نص في سيرته أنه كان خال ستار على المذبح. هذا الستار يعني كانوا جايبين لي من غير كنيسة، فيقول أنا شامت من هذا الستار كان يظهر عليه حبشي. فهذا النص يعني أنا انتبهت عليه أنه يعني مهم جدا. دا يوصف أنه من يظهر حبشي على ستار المذبح بالكنيسة مالته أنه يعني مثل الشيطان، فقال لهم رفعوا هذا الستار، يعني شالوه وحرقوه لأنه بي حبشي يظهر له. فأنا ما افتهمت يعني في من دا أقرأ النص ما فهمت يعني كيف يعني ظهر له حبشي يعني. فهسه افتهمت من عندك، أنا أشكرك جدا أنه افتهمت أنه معنى الحبشي بالنسبة للمسيحية القرن السادس الميلادي أنه كان يعني مثل الشيطان أو فد يعني فد شيء وحش يعني أو فعلا يعني شيطان. شكرا.
شكرا جزيلا إلى الترجمان and thank you very much for your question. There are 2 points. Yes, you are right. The sculptures are of soldiers, of Parthian soldiers, but I think the locals may have thought it's a story for why. Oh, sorry. Apologies. I thought my voice was loud enough. So thank you very much for your question, and thank you to the translator. The first part, to go into that, obviously they are sculptures of free Parthian soldiers. There's actually a 4th one, if I remember, on Amadea that was found. The point, however, is that it's possible that locals imagined out of this the idea that they were monsters. I've worked at a lot of different rock reliefs around the Middle East, and everyone has a tradition. The ones in Turkey are usually Büyük İskender, who must be depicted, whereas in Iraq it is usually Timurlenk who is meant. The idea that others imagine then that these are monsters that come out of the sculpture, maybe at night, and chase children, it is possible as a teleology for something which the people of Ahmadiyya see every day. In their story they mentioned the monsters wanted to raise up Ahmadiyya, which may explain, of course, the name. Ahmad comes from the idea of being raised up, and that is it is on a plateau. So that your second point about the church curtain and the Hambashaya is very interesting. I would like to talk more about that with you later. Thank you very much. One of the reasons why I presented this was the hope that a lot of Assyrians might come to me with different stories, and hence we could increase our Hambashaya database, if you like. Thank you very much for your comment.
Any further questions? Yes, Nazim.
All right, thank you. My question is to you.
To me.
Sorry. You spoke about Assyriology, and I understood that there is some continuity between Assyriology and Aramaic language. So my question is about the Syriac historians who wrote historical writings. When they wrote genealogy, they used the biblical genealogy. So my question is why? Is it because there was no genealogy in the Assyrian writing, or the Syriac historians chose to use this genealogy to associate themselves with the Bible? What do you think? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. Question, sorry. As I am naturally not a proper scholar of Syriac, I will limit my ideas to a couple of things to say quickly. One is that I have been very fascinated by the genealogies that I have found in Syriac history as a non-specialist, especially in the genealogy presented by Theodore Bar-Konai, which is very famous because it contains possibly the latest reference to Gilgamesh, who appears as a figure called Gamigos or Ganmigos or Galmigos. This is interesting because probably a metathesis has occurred from Gilgamesh to Gil Magus, so Gil the Magus, for example. but if you see the list in Bar Konai, you have on one side the sort of pagan kings, and they're then connected to the biblical patriarchs. So this patriarch was at this time, this one is at this time. However, if we look even back at the genealogies before, already if we look at Josephus, we see variants, interestingly, between different lists that he provides. For example, in one list, almost nobody has talked about this, in one list of the biblical patriarchs, he swaps out Gershon for a chap called Galgames, which is very strange. It seems to be literally a Levantine tradition about Gilgamesh, which for some reason, I do not know why, Josephus has included within his work. It is interesting that his genealogy begins by saying, people have said that the Jews are from Egypt, but I believe in fact that they are from Mesopotamia. So it is possible that he had multiple lists of patriarchs and similar, and he chose the one that seemed the most Mesopotamian to him, with the most characters. So what could be done, and I'm probably not the person to do it, but hopefully somebody here might be able to, would be to look at a lot of these genealogies which come down in different manuscripts of Syriac historians, and to see where they're getting them from, how they're transmitted, and which ones have Mesopotamian sort of information in them, and which of them do not, and whether we can find their motivations. I mentioned that quickly, one final thing, the example of the geography being moved from, for example, Erech, which should be Uruk, in the south, being moved to Edessa. This is also very interesting. There's a lot of references one finds of this sort of geography being moved around to fit sort of the contemporary period of time in which a particular historical work was written. And yes, there's this deep wish to harmonize things, I think, within Syriac historiography. And maybe we also have to ask ourselves why that is. It's an interesting question, why they wish to harmonize everything. But there's a whole lot to do and to look at. As a student, I was lucky in Heidelberg to read the Cave of Treasures, and I think that's still a cave of treasures that has a lot to be explored within it. Thank you very much for your question.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is for Bert Jacobs. You mentioned many times the sentence in Syriac that we read, مشحلاف الخون, and you read it مشحلاف الخون, and you mentioned the apostle has changed. I think my own reading is that مشحلاف الخون ساقيوثو, so you have changed many things in the gospel, instead that he, the apostle, has changed. My question is, are you planning to publish this commentary of Moshe Bar Kifo on Matthew? Second thing also linked, why are you calling it a summa theologiae? Because we know the genre of biblical commentaries, which began earlier with the commentary on the harmonized Gospels. So we have the genre of a continuous commentary on the Gospels, which is different from a theological treatise. So why you mentioned that this commentary is a summa? And my last question is about the commentary of Severus, the monk of the 8th century, which is attributed to Saint Ephrem. Have you noticed any links with the commentaries of Bar Kifa or of Josh of Baaltan? Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for this. First of all, for the comment. I will. Your proposition for the translation, I will look it up. So this presentation was based on 2 articles which will be published. So I edited the chapter of Church of Baaltan, and then I discuss also Barsalibi. And in this chapter, and this article, I published what remains of this particular chapter. So that has been my focus so far, only on this one particular chapter. I hope to be able to look more into the whole of Bar Kifo's introduction if I find some funding for it, maybe. And the question about the Summa. So you are right. The reason I started with this was the Summa Theologica. I wanted to show that there's like a connection, and we see developments. It's indeed a different genre, but we see a same movement of systematization. I call it theological systematization, and we see that it also happens in these introductions to biblical commentaries. Although it's a different genre, but I want to show that there are some connections also. And I find it interesting that in Jacob Barshako, this is a theological compendium, but he uses Barkifo's Hexameron commentary or this one. So there are some connections, but it's not the same. It's not the same thing. Indeed, these introductions are much more focused on questions related to the Bible, of course, but they also begin like Trinity and then incarnation. So they're very they comprise in a very short way. They want to also give like a précis of Christian doctrine. And yes, for your last question about which was it, Severus of Antioch? Yes, well, I don't know this text attributed to Ephraim by the monk Severus. Yeah.
The text published by السيمبوزيوم in the commentaries attributed to Ephraim.
Okay. Yes, I don't know it, but I will. It would be interesting to look more into it. Thank you.
I suspect that we should break off here because we're running late according to the program, and there's a chance to get some coffee before the next paper, which is Professor Alder Benjamin.
Yes, so everybody, we're going to have a break until 4:30, and then at 4:30 we're going to be back here for the second and final keynote speech for today, and then we're going to go on our excursion to the Syriac Museum. Thank you.
Go.
Well done, old boy. That was a lovely talk. I'm not an expert at all, but I liked it very much.
Yeah, well, I also liked yours. Very